In the medieval world, power did not always roar from castle battlements or clash loudly on battlefields. More often, it whispered through parchment, seals, and customs that shaped the rhythm of ordinary days, guiding what people wore, how they traded, when they worked, what they ate, and even how they mourned their dead. Across kingdoms, such as Kingdom of England, Kingdom of France, and the patchwork territories of the Holy Roman Empire, countless laws operated quietly beneath the grand dramas of kings and crusades, creating invisible fences that hemmed in everyday existence. One of the most pervasive systems was the web of feudal obligations, under which peasants bound to the land could not freely leave their lord's manor without permission. This was not always enforced with chains, but with custom and court fines, ensuring that harvests were gathered and rents paid. Villeins in England, for example, owed labour services, days ploughing demesne fields, or repairing roads, fixed not by personal choice, but by manorial rolls that recorded their duties with bureaucratic calm. If a daughter married outside the manor, a fine might be levied. If a son inherited land, an entry fee was due. Even death triggered the heriot, a payment of the best animal to the lord, a final reminder that one's life had unfolded under layered obligations. Sumptuary laws further tightened social boundaries by regulating clothing and display, transforming fabric into a legal matter. In parts of medieval Europe, only nobles could wear certain furs, like ermine or colours, dyed with expensive pigments, silk, velvet, and gold embroidery, were restricted by rank. These laws were justified as preserving social order and moral discipline, but they functioned as daily reminders of hierarchy, making a tunic or cloak a declaration of permitted identity. A merchant growing wealthy could not simply dress like a knight without risking penalties. Aspiration was trimmed at the hemline in Italian city. States, regulations, limited the number of rings a bride might wear or the cost of wedding feasts, reflecting anxieties about extravagance and competition. Thus celebration itself was legislated, and joy measured against statute. Markets too were governed by meticulous ordinances. Guild regulations dictated who could practice a trade, how apprenticeships were served, what tools were used, and what prices were acceptable. In London, under the City of London Corporation, bakers were subject to the assize of bread, which fixed the weight and price of loaves, according to grain costs. Deviation could mean fines, public humiliation, or worse. The pillory and stocks were not merely theatrical punishments, but mechanisms reinforcing commercial trust. Butchers were required to slaughter animals in designated areas. Tanners were pushed to city edges due to smell. Fishmongers had to observe freshness standards. The quiet tyranny of regulation meant that even the shape of a loaf or the width of a cloth bolt was subject to inspection, making economic life a choreography of compliance. Religious observance intertwined with law in ways that structured time itself. In Christian realms, the calendar of holy days and fasts, shaped by the authority of the Catholic Church, dictated when meat could be eaten, when marriages could be solemnized, and when work should cease. Lenten restrictions were not mere suggestions. In some towns, selling meat during forbidden periods invited sanctions. Attendance at Mass could be legally required. And heresy was not simply a theological disagreement, but a punishable offence, investigated by institutions such as the medieval Inquisition. Thus belief, Diet and weekly routine were interwoven with enforceable expectations, narrowing the space between conscience and compliance. Marriage and family life were similarly constrained. Canon law defined degrees of consanguinity within which unions were forbidden, reaching out to distant cousins and requiring dispensations for exceptions. Inheritance customs like primogeniture ensured that land passed intact to eldest sons, shaping sibling destinies from birth. Younger children often entered monasteries, convents, or military service, not solely by vocation, but by structural necessity. Women's legal identities were frequently subsumed under male guardianship. In many regions, a married woman's property rights were limited, and contracts required her husband's consent. Dowries were negotiated with legal precision, and disputes over them could last years. Even widowhood came with statutes determining what portion of land could be retained as dower, and for how long, binding grief to paperwork. Urban life offered freedoms compared to rural serfdom, yet it too was circumscribed by charters and bylaws. Curfews required citizens to extinguish hearth fires at set hours to prevent blazes in timber. Built towns, gates closed at night, and late entry could draw suspicion. Sanitation rules attempted to control waste disposal, forbidding the dumping of refuse into streets or rivers, though enforcement varied. Noise regulations sometimes limited certain activities at night, revealing that medieval people valued order and rest as much as we do. Even games and leisure were regulated in England. Archery practice was mandated on Sundays to ensure military readiness, while certain sports were banned for distracting from it. Recreation became an extension of state interest. Agricultural routines were shaped by open field systems and communal bylaws, determining when to sow, reap, and pasture animals. A farmer could not simply fence off common land at will. Grazing rights were shared and timed. The ringing of bells signalled not only worship, but work rhythms, embedding authority in sound. Forest laws reserved vast tracts for royal hunting in places like England after the Norman conquest, and unauthorized poaching could result in severe punishment. The deer and boar roaming these forests symbolized privilege. To kill one without leave was to challenge hierarchy itself. Thus hunger might tempt, but statute stood guard over the king's game. Taxation laws threaded through all layers of society. Poll taxes, hearth taxes, and tolls on bridges or markets extracted revenue with bureaucratic persistence. The English poll tax of 1381 contributed to unrest culminating in the Peasants' Revolt, demonstrating how quiet fiscal measures could ignite loud consequences. Yet most of the time, taxes were endured rather than rebelled against, folded into expectations like bad weather. Records kept in exchequer rolls and local courts tracked payments with careful script, turning livelihoods into ledger entries. Legal procedure itself was an everyday presence. Manorial courts handled disputes over boundary lines, unpaid debts, and minor assaults, while higher courts addressed serious crimes. Oaths sworn on relics or Bibles carried spiritual weight. Perjury endangered not just reputation, but the soul. Trial by ordeal had largely faded by the later Middle Ages, replaced with jury systems in England, embedding communal judgment into law. The fact that neighbours might sit in judgment over neighbours fostered both accountability and tension. Reputation became a kind of currency, legally consequential. Travel was subject to passes and permissions in some regions, especially during times of plague or unrest. During outbreaks like the Black Death, authorities imposed quarantine measures, restricting movement to curb contagion. Labour laws after the plague, such as England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, revealing anxiety about worker mobility and bargaining power. A survivor seeking better pay could be legally compelled back to previous terms, illustrating how catastrophe prompted tighter control. Minorities faced additional layers of restriction. Jewish communities in medieval Europe were often confined to specific quarters, required to wear distinguishing badges, and limited in occupations. Measures that combined economic regulation with prejudice. Such laws did not merely reflect bias. They structured daily vulnerability. Similarly, in parts of Iberia under Christian and Muslim rule, convivencia coexisted with fluctuating legal boundaries that governed dress, worship, and property rights for different faith groups. The law could pivot with regime change, turning neighbours into outsiders overnight. Education and literacy were also regulated through institutions. Universities operated under charters granting privileges. But imposing discipline, students might be subject to clerical courts rather than local ones, creating dual legal identities. Apprenticeship contracts locked youths into years of service, with penalties for desertion. Time itself was parcelled into terms and seasons. The linked personal growth with institutional expectation. Even death did not escape regulation. Burial practices were governed by churchyards' consecration rules. Suicides could be denied burial in sacred ground, and their property confiscated. Wills required witnesses and adherence to forms. Disputes could entangle families for generations. The boundary between life and afterlife was administratively managed. These laws rarely announced themselves as oppressive. They were woven into custom, justified as preserving order, morality, and stability. Yet their cumulative effect was profound. They shaped identity through clothing, choreographed labor through obligation, regulated desire through marriage codes, and structured aspiration through inheritance. They marked time with feast days and curfews, measured trade with standardized weights, and disciplined speech with heresy statutes. To live in the medieval period was to inhabit a lattice of expectations, some protective, some restrictive, all pervasive. And yet within these constraints, people negotiated, resisted, adapted. Lords commuted labour services into money rents. There were also regulations that governed reputation in ways that shaped how carefully people lived their daily lives. In small medieval communities, being labelled of ill fame could limit one's ability to testify in court, join a guild, or secure trustworthy partnerships. Reputation was not merely social currency, it had legal consequences. Courts sometimes relied on a person's standing in the community to determine credibility. A life lived visibly and respectably was not just moral ambition but practical necessity. In many areas, inns and taverns were required to close at certain hours, and tavern keepers could be punished if violence broke out inside their establishments. Hosts were responsible for maintaining peace. The act of pouring ale carried liability. Hospitality was monitored to prevent conspiracy, gambling excess, or drunken disorder. Village common lands, pastures, woodlands, and water sources were governed by detailed bylaws dictating how many animals each household could graze. Overgrazing threatened communal survival. These limits were recorded, and exceeding them could lead to fines or confiscation of livestock. The quiet counting of sheep and cattle was a legal exercise. Seasonal fasting requirements shaped diet across Christian Europe. Meat consumption during Lent was restricted, and in some towns, butchers were forbidden to sell certain products during these periods. Compliance was both religious and communal expectation. Food choices followed calendar law. In certain towns, residents were obligated to keep watch during designated nights as part of a rotating duty. Failure to report for watch could incur penalty. Security was collective labor. Apprentices often had clauses in their contracts forbidding marriage until training was complete. Romantic independence was postponed in service of vocational discipline. In regions vulnerable to flooding, authorities sometimes mandated maintenance of dikes and drainage systems, assigning sections to landholders. Neglect could lead to fines, as one person's failure endangered many. Even burial plots in churchyards were regulated. Families could not simply claim space indefinitely. Burial locations might be reassigned over generations due to limited land. The organization of death followed spatial planning. Merchants traveling across territories sometimes required letters of safe conduct bearing official seals. Without them, suspicion or confiscation could occur. Paperwork became portable protection. In some medieval towns, public baths were regulated for cleanliness and conduct. Mixed bathing could be restricted, and immoral behavior punished. Hygiene and morality overlapped in regulation. Silk importation was occasionally restricted to prevent economic imbalance or moral extravagance. Luxury goods were filtered through regulation. Marriage dowries had to be recorded formally to ensure future disputes could be resolved. These documents were legal anchors for decades. Peasants seeking to move from serfdom to freedom in certain regions could purchase manumission, but the process required formal documentation and fee. Freedom itself had procedural structure. Market days were sometimes staggered between neighboring towns to avoid direct competition, an early example of regulated economic planning. Village assemblies could impose fines for failure to maintain hedgerows or fences, as neglected boundaries caused conflict. Public gambling during feast days might be temporarily tolerated but restricted outside them. Recreation followed calendar law. Craft guilds sometimes inspected workshops to ensure apprentices were properly fed and housed. Welfare was regulated, though unevenly enforced. Land disputes over shifting riverbanks required legal measurement and arbitration, as natural changes altered property lines. Monastic lands often enjoyed exemption from certain taxes, creating layers of privilege codified in charters. In plague periods, clothing from infected households could be marked or destroyed. Fear of disease reshaped property rights. Travel restrictions could be imposed during times of rebellion to prevent movement of suspected agitators. Village bells signaling fire required immediate communal response. Ignoring the call could bring penalty. Some regions required residents to store grain reserves for emergencies, creating legally structured preparedness. Foreign artisans sometimes had to work under supervision of local guild masters before being granted independence. In rural areas, failure to attend communal court sessions could result in fines, reinforcing participatory governance. Households could be fined for allowing pigs to roam freely in urban streets due to sanitation concerns. Even funeral expenses might be capped to prevent ostentatious displays that challenged social hierarchy. Debt forgiveness agreements required witnesses and seals, transforming private negotiation into recorded contract. In frontier regions, settlers sometimes received temporary tax exemptions to encourage development, after which full obligations resumed. Public marketplaces were sometimes restructured by ordinance to widen streets after fires, demonstrating how disaster translated into new regulation. Everyday medieval life was therefore shaped by countless layers of oversight, some protective, some restrictive, most normalized. The extraordinary events of kings and crusades rested upon this quiet framework. What makes these laws remarkable is their subtlety. They did not always rely on harsh punishment. Many functioned through expectation and habit. A baker weighed bread carefully, not because soldiers stood at his door, but because inspection was possible. A peasant attended harvest at the proper time because communal order depended on synchronization. Control operated through routine. Yet within this system, adaptation was constant. People negotiated exemptions, purchased privileges, cited precedent, and gradually expanded freedoms. Over centuries, the habit of recording rights and obligations strengthened the idea that authority itself could be limited by documented law. Thus, medieval society was not defined solely by dramatic displays of power, but by the steady, repetitive enforcement of small rules shaping land use, trade, clothing, diet, marriage, inheritance, speech, and movement. These quiet laws structured identity and opportunity so thoroughly that life unfolded along their lines almost automatically. From dawn bell to curfew, from market stall to manor court, from apprenticeship contract to burial record, medieval existence moved within a carefully constructed legal architecture. It rarely shouted its presence. It persisted, and in that persistence lay its true strength. Not domination through constant violence, but governance through continuous structure, woven so deeply into daily routine that it felt less like control and more like the natural order of the world. There were also layers of regulation that governed what might seem like the smallest gestures of daily conduct. In many towns, citizens were required to keep the stretch of street directly outside their homes clean and passable. Refuse thrown from upper windows could bring fines, especially if it obstructed drainage channels. The ordinary act of sweeping one's doorway was therefore not only domestic pride but civic obligation. Urban order depended on thousands of such small, enforceable habits. Lighting was another subtle point of control. In some later medieval cities, residents were required to hang lanterns outside during winter evenings or on designated festival nights to improve safety. Darkness was associated with theft and unrest, so illumination became regulated responsibility. Conversely, open flames in wooden districts were monitored strictly to prevent catastrophic fires. Fire was warmth and danger at once, and law hovered around it constantly. Even the keeping of pigs within city walls was sometimes restricted. Urban pigs could roam freely, feeding on refuse, but when they damaged property or injured people, authorities imposed limits. Owners might be fined, animals confiscated, or herding rules tightened. Sanitation and safety were negotiated through regulation. Craft production often involved quality stamps or seals. Cloth makers, goldsmiths and other artisans, marked goods to show compliance with guild standards. Selling unstamped goods could result in confiscation. Trust in trade rested not only on reputation, but on visible proof of regulation. Noise was managed more carefully than modern assumptions suggest. Nighttime disturbances could be punished, particularly during holy seasons or after curfew. Public singing, shouting, or brawling might incur penalties. Peace was protected as communal asset. In agricultural life, shared ploughing schedules ensured that fields were turned in coordinated patterns. If one farmer delayed or hurried beyond agreement, the entire system could be disrupted. Village courts enforced timing to preserve efficiency. Individual preference yielded to collective necessity. Inheritance rules sometimes specified not only land distribution, but movable goods, pots, bedding, tools, carefully inventoried. These lists served as safeguards against disputes and reveal how thoroughly daily objects were embedded in legal frameworks. Debt agreements often required guarantors known as sureties. If the debtor failed to pay, the surety bore responsibility. Social networks became legal safety nets. Trust had formal backing. Clergy were not exempt from regulation. Church officials could be disciplined for neglecting duties, and bishops held visitations to inspect parish conduct. Spiritual authority contained administrative oversight. In some territories, sumptuary laws limited the number of dishes served at banquets to discourage excess. Feasting had boundaries. Harvest gleaning rights were sometimes formally protected for widows. Beyond all the visible rules about land, trade, marriage, and faith, there existed another layer of medieval control that was almost psychological in nature. Laws and customs that shaped how people thought about order, obedience, and possibility. Authority was not only something encountered in courts or marketplaces, it was internalized. Take hierarchy, for example. Medieval society was structured around the idea of the great chain of being, a belief that everything in existence had a fixed place, from God to kings, from nobles to peasants, from humans to animals. While not a statute written on parchment, this worldview was reinforced by legal systems everywhere. Sumptuary laws limited clothing by rank. Inheritance laws preserved noble bloodlines. Feudal contracts bound peasants to land. Over time, these rules trained people to see hierarchy as natural. Law and belief merged into one structure. Silence itself could be political. In village courts, ordinary people were expected to speak when summoned and remain silent otherwise. Interrupting proceedings could lead to fines. Deference was ritualized. Caps removed, bows given, titles used properly. Language followed status. Calling a lord by the wrong title was not simply rude. It could be interpreted as disrespectful defiance. In many regions, communities were required to collectively report crimes. Failure to raise the hue and cry when witnessing theft or violence could bring penalties. Justice was participatory. Villagers were legally bound to chase a fleeing criminal. The burden of order did not sit solely with officials, it rested on neighbors. Community became enforcement mechanism. Even clothing repair could be scrutinized. Some guilds required official approval before selling second-hand goods. Fearing undercutting of new production, wearing excessively patched garments in urban settings could signal vagrancy and draw suspicion. Poverty itself was policed visually. Medieval calendars structured not only work but emotion. Lent demanded restraint. Advent encouraged reflection. Feast days allowed celebration. These cycles were not optional in deeply religious societies, shaped by the authority of the Church. Skipping required observance without valid reason could draw ecclesiastical attention. Time was sacredly regulated. Noise pollution, though not described in modern terms, was addressed through ordinances. Blacksmiths might be restricted in certain hours. Markets could be ordered to close before dark. Public shouting during nighttime could bring reprimand. Urban peace depended on controlled sound. Craft guilds sometimes forbade working at night by candlelight, arguing that poor lighting produced inferior goods and unfair advantage. This meant productivity was limited by regulation, not ambition. The length of the day was legally defined. Marriage age, though variable, was influenced by canon law. While consent was central, economic and parental control shaped timing. Secret marriages, though technically valid under certain circumstances, were discouraged and sometimes punished. Public declaration ensured communal oversight. In borderlands or unstable regions, carrying official tokens or letters, proving loyalty, might protect against accusations of spying. Identity was portable documentation. Execution sites were often outside city walls, but publicly visible, reinforcing consequence without constant brutality. Punishment was spectacle, but infrequent spectacle relied on daily obedience built through quieter laws. In certain towns, foreigners had to register their arrival and declare goods. Unregistered presence created suspicion. Movement was tracked in rudimentary but intentional ways. Public wells were sometimes locked at night to prevent contamination or theft. Access to water followed rule. Apprentices were often forbidden from playing dice or frequenting taverns. Masters could report disobedience to guild courts. Recreation was supervised. Laws about inheritance sometimes required inventories of household goods to prevent concealment of assets. Officials recorded bedding, pots, livestock, tools. Private life was itemized. In plague-stricken towns, houses marked with symbols indicating infection were legally isolated. Guards could be posted to enforce quarantine. Daily life narrowed to interior confinement. Fences and hedges had regulated height limits in certain places to prevent obstruction of roads or defensive sightlines. Even vegetation had legal boundaries. Village brewing or baking monopolies ensured communal quality, but also centralized economic control. Individual initiative was shaped by authorized facilities. In some territories, lighting torches during curfew required reason. Wandering without purpose could result in detention. Suspicion was embedded in night travel. During harvest, gleaning before official permission could be punished as theft. Even poverty had to wait its turn. What stands out in all of this is not constant violence, but constant face structure. Medieval law rarely needed to appear dramatic because it was woven into expectation. Most people did not wake fearing arrest. They woke knowing the shape of their obligations. And yet, despite this pervasive control, there was humanity within it. Courts sometimes reduced fines for hardship. Lords forgave arrears after famine. Guilds supported widows of deceased members. Law was rigid, but society was not entirely without compassion. Over centuries, these countless quiet regulations built habits of documentation, precedent, and administrative governance. They laid foundations for later legal systems. What began as local custom became recorded statute. What was once enforced through communal memory became archived. So when we look at medieval life, we should not imagine chaos or unchecked brutality. We should imagine bells marking hours, gates closing at dusk, loaves weighed carefully, oaths sworn publicly, fields harvested in unison, clothing signalling rank, markets opening by charter, and neighbours accountable for one another. The control was not always loud, it was steady. It shaped routine rather than erupting constantly. It lived in repetition. From birth, recorded in parish registers, to marriage announced in church, to taxes assessed on hearth and harvest, to burial within consecrated ground. Medieval existence unfolded inside a framework of quiet, persistent law. And perhaps that is the most powerful kind of control. Not the sword raised high, but the rule repeated daily until it feels like nature itself. There were also unwritten expectations so firmly embedded in custom that they carried the force of law even before being written down. Medieval societies depended heavily on precedent. What had always been done? If a lord attempted to demand a new fee not grounded in memory or record, villagers might resist, arguing it violated ancient custom. That appeal to the past was itself a legal weapon. Tradition functioned as shield and chain at once. In many regions, ovens, presses, and slaughterhouses operated under banal rights, meaning tenants were legally required to use the lord's facilities for baking bread, pressing grapes, or milling grain, paying a fee each time. The smoke rising from a communal oven was not merely domestic life, it was revenue. The daily act of eating was quietly taxed through infrastructure ownership. Households were sometimes required to keep ladders, buckets, or other basic firefighting tools, ready for inspection in dense towns prone to fire. Civic officials could fine those who neglected preparation. Responsibility for safety was decentralized but enforceable. Clothing repair and resale markets were occasionally regulated to prevent theft. Selling second-hand goods required proof of ownership in some cities, attempting to limit black markets. Even worn garments circulated within oversight. In rural courts, disputes over stray animals, damaging crops were common enough that detailed procedures evolved. Crops were measured for loss, and compensation calculated precisely. A wandering cow could trigger legal paperwork. Oath-taking ceremonies reinforced loyalty not only to kings but to local officials. Swearing fealty was ritualized submission, blending religion and governance. Breaking such oaths was not simply political betrayal but spiritual peril. Certain regions imposed rules about hedge, cutting or tree, planting along roads to maintain visibility for travelers and soldiers. Landscape management intertwined with security. In port cities, quarantine regulations sometimes required ships suspected of plague exposure to anchor offshore for 40 days. The origin of the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta. Trade paused under legal caution. Fear of contagion shaped maritime routine. Public morality statutes occasionally targeted ostentatious feasts. Weddings were limited in guest count or expenditure to prevent families from bankrupting themselves or inciting envy. Celebration was economically moderated. Village officials like reeves or constables were required to present annual accounts to manorial courts, detailing fines collected and disputes settled. Transparency, though imperfect, was embedded. During harvest shortages, authorities sometimes forbade brewing to conserve grain for bread. Ale production, a daily norm, could be suspended by decree. Funeral processions in some cities were restricted in route and size to prevent crowding or rivalry between families. Even mourning was scheduled and mapped. Apprenticeship contracts often included clauses forbidding participation in riots or factional conflicts. Political neutrality was mandated for those in training. Foreign merchants were sometimes confined to specific quarters and barred from staying beyond designated fair days. Trade access existed within temporal limits. Certain hunting dogs were required to have their claws blunted in royal forests, beyond the visible frameworks of feudal duty, guild oversight, and religious expectation. Medieval life was further shaped by smaller, almost invisible rules that settled into habits so deeply. They felt like nature. In villages scattered across the Kingdom of England and the rural provinces of the Kingdom of France, bylaws governed something as simple as when animals could graze on shared meadows. The open field system required cooperation enforced by regulation. If one farmer harvested early or fenced land improperly, he disrupted the synchronized pattern that ensured fairness. So rules dictated the exact season for turning livestock onto stubble fields, and penalties followed those who acted independently. Individual initiative bowed to collective rhythm, and law preserved that rhythm like a conductor's quiet baton. Weights and measures were another subtle instrument of control. Official bushels, gallons, and ell. Wands were kept in town halls to ensure standardization. Inspectors moved through marketplaces comparing merchants' tools against these sanctioned models. A short measure was not merely bad practice, it was punishable deceit. In this way, the law inserted itself into the very space between buyer and seller, shaping trust. A housewife purchasing ale could rely, at least theoretically, on consistency, because ordnance hovered over the transaction. Economic predictability became a legal achievement, even if imperfectly enforced. Building codes existed long before modern zoning boards. In crowded medieval towns where timber frames leaned toward each other across narrow lanes, authorities sometimes required stone construction in certain districts. After devastating fires, thatch roofing might be restricted within city walls. Chimneys had to meet specifications. These rules were not dramatic proclamations, but administrative responses to lived disaster, quietly reshaping skylines. A craftsman repairing his house had to consider not just cost and comfort, but compliance. Architecture, therefore, was a dialogue with law. Food itself fell under scrutiny. The brewing of ale, a daily staple safer than many water sources, was often overseen by local ale, tasters appointed to ensure quality and price fairness. Women frequently brewed ale at home for sale, but they did so under watchful ordinances. If the ale was too weak or too expensive, fines followed. Thus domestic skill intersected with public accountability. Similarly, in some regions, slaughtering animals outside designated spaces risked contamination and legal trouble. The boundary between household and state blurred over the dinner table. Silence and sound were not beyond regulation. Bells structured time, but they were also controlled instruments. Unauthorized ringing could signal rebellion or panic. Night watchmen enforced curfew laws, moving through streets with lanterns and halberds. After a certain hour, wandering without explanation could lead to questioning. Darkness was associated with disorder, and law sought to domesticate it. The medieval night, romanticized in hindsight, was in practice a period of scrutiny. Charity and poverty were likewise shaped by legal thinking. Begging without authorization could be punished in certain towns, especially as urban populations grew. Some municipalities issued badges or tokens to approved beggars, distinguishing the deserving poor from vagrants. Compassion became administratively filtered. This classification system revealed anxieties about mobility and fraud, but it also meant survival sometimes depended on recognition by officials. Poverty was not only economic, it was regulated status. The regulation of morality extended into taverns and festivities. Drinking houses were licensed in various regions, and hosts bore responsibility for maintaining order. Gambling could be restricted or limited to certain times. Carnival celebrations, though exuberant, often unfolded within parameters set by civic authorities wary of disorder. Even joy required supervision. Authorities feared that unregulated gathering could morph into conspiracy, so they permitted celebration but hedged it with oversight. Clothing laws reached beyond luxury fabrics to symbolic markers. In some areas, specific groups, whether religious minorities or marginalized professions, were required to wear identifying signs. These mandates transformed garments into declarations of legal identity. Clothing thus functioned as a passport, instantly communicating one's place within a structured hierarchy. Social mobility could be economically possible, yet visually constrained, a paradox stitched into daily attire. Labor mobility was another subtle battlefield. Following demographic shifts after the Black Death, surviving workers found their labor more valuable. Yet statutes like England's Statute of Labourers attempted to tether wages and prevent migration in search of better pay. A ploughman leaving his village without permission risked legal action. Employers offering higher wages could be fined. The market tugged toward flexibility. The law pulled back toward stability. Ordinary workers stood at this tension point, their aspirations quietly negotiated through edicts. Water rights and milling monopolies further illustrate law's everyday reach. Lords often controlled mills, requiring tenants to grind grain there for a fee. Using a hand quern at home might violate manorial custom. The act of turning grain into flour, a basic survival task, was thus monetized and regulated. Rivers were similarly governed. Fishing rights, bridge tolls, and ferry operations were structured by charter. A fisherman casting a net had to consider not only skill and luck, but jurisdiction. Education, though limited to certain classes, carried its own web of discipline. Cathedral schools, and later universities, operated under ecclesiastical authority. Students were often clerics in minor orders, subject to church courts rather than secular ones. This dual jurisdiction sometimes created tension with townspeople, leading to conflicts that themselves resulted in negotiated privileges. Knowledge grew within boundaries shaped by legal identity. Medical practice, rudimentary by modern standards, was not free from regulation. In some cities, physicians and surgeons required licenses from civic or royal authorities. Unauthorized practice could incur fines. Apothecaries were inspected to ensure the purity of ingredients. Even healing was subject to bureaucratic oversight, blending emerging professional standards with public protection. Inheritance customs extended beyond primogeniture. In parts of Europe, partible inheritance divided land among sons, gradually fragmenting holdings. This system, too, was legally structured, influencing economic sustainability and migration patterns. Families calculated marriages and dowries with an eye toward these frameworks. A daughter's dowry was not only familial generosity but legal transfer, affecting long-term wealth distribution. Military obligation often rested on legal expectation. Free men might be required to serve in local levies for a specified number of days per year. Equipment standards could be mandated according to wealth. A man owning property above a certain value might need to provide armor or a horse. Defense was communal duty defined in statute. Even those who never saw battle felt its quiet preparation in mandatory training or taxation. The Church's moral courts addressed issues such as slander, adultery, and failure to fulfill marriage promises. Gossip could escalate into formal accusation. Words spoken in anger might lead to penance imposed by ecclesiastical judges. Speech itself carried legal risk, demonstrating that control extended into conversation. Reputation was safeguarded not only by community norms, but by institutional power. Transportation and trade routes were shaped by tolls and safe conduct requirements. Merchants traveling between towns needed documentation in certain contexts. Especially during periods of conflict, roads and bridges, often funded by tolls, were spaces of monitored passage. Commerce depended on the predictability of these systems, yet travellers experienced them as recurring interruptions, small payments accumulating across distance. Punishment practices reinforced compliance, not just through severity, but visibility. Stocks placed offenders in public view, turning discipline into communal theatre. The goal was less prolonged suffering than memorable warning. The sight of a neighbour confined for violating market regulations served as cautionary tale. Law communicated through example. All these measures, so ordinary, so procedural, created a society deeply structured by written and customary codes. Yet medieval people were not passive subjects drifting through imposed order. They petitioned lords for redress, appealed fines, negotiated charters, and sometimes revolted. Custom itself could be invoked against authority. Tenants might argue that a demand violated ancient usage. Thus law was a living conversation, though unequal in power. The quietness of these laws lies in their normalization. A child born into a village learned from earliest memory that bells marked work, that certain clothes were inappropriate, that certain days required fasting, that certain spaces were forbidden. These lessons were absorbed before literacy, before abstract understanding. Law was embodied habit. To step outside, it required conscious defiance. And yet within constraint lay cohesion. Shared rules fostered predictable interaction. Standard measures prevented constant dispute. Communal agricultural timing maximized yield. Licensing of trades maintained reputational quality. In this sense, control also provided structure in a world lacking modern infrastructure. The same regulation that limited freedom could also create stability. When we imagine medieval life, we often see castles, tournaments, and dramatic decrees. Even the landscape itself was quietly partitioned by law in ways that most medieval people rarely questioned but constantly experienced. Boundaries between fields were not only marked by hedges or stones, but by recorded custom, recited during seasonal perambulations, when villagers walked the edges of their parish to reaffirm collective memory. Children were sometimes tapped or bumped at boundary markers, so they would physically remember where one jurisdiction ended and another began. Geography was legal knowledge carried in the body. To cross an unseen line with livestock, plough or axe could trigger dispute, and disputes meant fines or court appearances. The earth beneath one's feet was layered with invisible claims. Timekeeping, too, was regulated beyond church bells. In certain towns, milling hours were fixed, and markets could operate only on designated days. Weekly markets and annual fairs were granted by royal or seigneurial charter, meaning trade itself had a calendar authorized from above. Unauthorized markets were treated as economic trespass. This prevented competition that might undermine existing privileges, but also stabilized regional commerce. A farmer planning to sell surplus grain had to align with the lawful market day, weaving personal livelihood into officially sanctioned time. Weapons ownership was frequently controlled in subtle gradations. In many regions of medieval Europe, free men were expected to own arms suitable to their status. Yet carrying weapons within town walls might be restricted. Blades had to be peace, bound, secured, so they could not be drawn quickly during certain gatherings. After riots or feuds, municipal councils sometimes banned weapon, carrying outright for periods of tension. Thus, the same sword that symbolized duty could become illegal in another context. Authority calibrated fear and preparedness with careful regulation. Craft production was meticulously supervised, not only for quality but secrecy. Guild statutes often forbade artisans from teaching trade techniques to outsiders without permission. Knowledge was proprietary, and leaking it could bring penalties. Apprentices signed agreements binding them for years, promising obedience and moral conduct. A runaway apprentice could be pursued and returned, reflecting how vocational identity was both opportunity and confinement. Economic survival required belonging to a recognized structure. Lighting in towns, especially in later medieval centuries, sometimes fell under civic order. Householders were required to hang lanterns outside during certain festivals, or in winter evenings to reduce crime. Conversely, open flames in hazardous conditions could incur penalty. Fire was both necessity and threat, and law mediated that duality. The ordinary act of tending a hearth was therefore a civic responsibility as much as private comfort. Speech regulations extended into the marketplace through proclamations controlling rumour during war or plague. Spreading false news that might cause panic could be punishable. Medieval authorities understood the destabilizing power of unchecked information, even if their tools were limited. Town criers functioned as sanctioned channels of announcement, their words carrying legal weight. Communication was centralized to preserve order. Apprentices and servants often faced dress codes imposed by employers or civic decree, distinguishing them from masters. In some towns, Servants were forbidden to wear swords or luxurious fabrics, regardless of personal means. These rules prevented social ambiguity. Hierarchy had to be visible to function smoothly, and law ensured clarity. Environmental management also bore legal imprint. Cutting timber in certain forests without permission was theft, even if trees seemed abundant. Peasants relied on wood for fuel and building. But forest laws, especially in territories influenced by Norman governance, restricted access. Gathering fallen branches might be tolerated, felling live trees might not. Such distinctions mattered deeply during harsh winters. Law rationed nature. Maritime communities experienced equally structured oversight. Fishermen required licenses in some ports, and catch quotas were occasionally enforced to prevent depletion. Harbour masters monitored docking rights and levied port fees. A sailor's livelihood depended on understanding these maritime ordinances as intimately as the tides. Even the sea, vast and unpredictable, was threaded with jurisdiction. Debt and credit systems were codified through bonds and recognizances. Failure to repay could result in property seizure or imprisonment. Debtors' prisons existed in embryonic forms and sureties. Individuals who guaranteed another's obligation could suffer consequences for default. Economic relationships thus extended beyond trust into enforceable commitment. A handshake might be symbolic, but parchment sealed accountability. Festivals that appear riotous in historical imagination were often bracketed by legal expectation. Feast days required church attendance before revelry. Processions followed approved routes. Guild banners could be displayed only by recognized members. Even theatrical performances. Mystery plays dramatizing biblical stories were supervised by civic authorities, ensuring doctrinal conformity and crowd control. Celebration unfolded within choreography. Public health measures, though primitive, emerged during crises. Quarantine regulations in port cities required ships from plague, affected regions to anchor offshore for specified days before unloading. Travelers might carry certificates affirming origin. These measures, unevenly enforced, nonetheless reveal a legal response to invisible threat. The fear of contagion translated into bureaucratic experimentation. Prisons and holding cells, though not central to punishment in early medieval centuries, gradually became more common. Pretrial detention ensured accused individuals appeared in court. Bail systems allowed temporary freedom for a pledged sum. Legal process thus shaped daily anxiety. An accusation could disrupt family and labor for weeks. Agricultural innovation sometimes clashed with tradition. If a tenant introduced a new crop rotation method that altered communal grazing patterns, neighbors could object legally. Innovation required negotiation. Stability was prized over individual experimentation when shared resources were involved. Law guarded continuity. Widows and orphans, often perceived as vulnerable, were placed under guardianship systems regulated by courts. Guardians managed estates until heirs came of age, theoretically protecting assets, but sometimes exploiting them. Oversight mechanisms attempted to limit abuse, though success varied. The protection of the weak was entwined with opportunities for control. Language itself intersected with authority in multilingual regions. In England after the Norman conquest, legal proceedings often employed Anglo-Norman French or Latin, distancing ordinary English speakers from full comprehension. This linguistic layer reinforced hierarchy. Understanding law required education or assistance. Translation was power. Even animals fell under statute. Stray livestock damaging crops could be impounded until fines were paid. Dogs might be required to be muzzled in royal forests to prevent poaching. Bees, valuable for honey and wax, were subject to ownership disputes codified in custom. The management of animals mirrored management of people. Regulated movement controlled reproduction, designated spaces. Borderlands between realms experienced fluctuating legal allegiance. A village near a contested frontier might change sovereign authority within a generation, bringing new taxes, new weights and measures, new dress codes. Residents adapted pragmatically, but their routines shifted with political winds. Law proved both persistent and fragile. Perhaps most pervasive was the culture of oath-taking. Allegiance oaths bound subjects to rulers. Guild members swore loyalty. Jurors swore to tell truth. Vassals swore fealty. Breaking an oath was not only legal violation, but spiritual peril. The act of swearing formalized obligation, making conscience an enforcement mechanism. Fear of divine judgment reinforced secular rule. Over time, written documentation expanded. Charters, court rolls, tax registers, guild statutes, all accumulated in chests and archives. The growth of record keeping meant memory became institutional rather than purely oral. What had once depended on communal recollection could now be verified against parchment. This transition quietly strengthened administrative reach. Yet amid this dense network of regulation, negotiation never ceased. Communities bargained collectively for reduced taxes during famine. Guilds revised statutes when economic realities shifted. Monarchs granted exemptions to favoured towns. Peasants cited custom from time immemorial to resist new impositions. Law was both constraint and conversation, static in form, yet dynamic in application. The cumulative effect of these quiet medieval laws was not constant oppression, but structured predictability. Life unfolded within mapped expectations, the rhythm of sowing and reaping, of fasting and feasting, of apprenticeship and mastery, of oath and inheritance, followed lines etched by authority long before individual choice emerged. People rarely saw themselves as trapped. They saw themselves as situated. Belonging meant accepting boundaries. In this sense, medieval control was less about surveillance in the modern sense and more about integration. Law saturated community life so thoroughly that it felt organic. To disobey was to disrupt not only rule but harmony. Bells rang, gates closed, loaves were weighed, garments inspected, markets licensed, oaths sworn. Through repetition, regulation became culture, and so everyday medieval existence was neither chaotic nor lawless, but intricately ordered. Beyond the rhythms of market, manor, and parish, medieval authority extended into corners of life so ordinary that they often passed without remark. Yet each carried the imprint of rule. Consider the household itself. In many regions, householders were legally responsible for the behavior of those under their roof. A master could be fined if a servant committed certain offences, and innkeepers were accountable for crimes or disturbances occurring within their establishments. Hospitality was therefore not purely generous. It was a calculated risk shaped by liability. To offer lodging meant assuming legal exposure. binding private generosity to public order. Firearms did not yet define warfare, but crossbows and longbows did, and in some territories their use was regulated with precision. In parts of medieval Europe, crossbows were restricted because of their lethality, sometimes even condemned by church councils when used against fellow Christians. While enforcement varied, the very existence of such prohibitions reveals anxiety over technological change. Innovation triggered regulation. Authority responded to new power with new constraint. Rural justice often operated through frank pledge systems, especially in England, where groups of households were collectively responsible for producing accused members before court. If one person fled, the group could be fined. This collective accountability fostered surveillance not from above, but sideways, neighbours monitoring neighbours. Order was communalised. Individual freedom bent beneath shared obligation. Charcoal burners, miners and salt producers, industries critical to survival, were sometimes subject to special oversight because their activities affected broader resources. Mining rights could belong to a lord or the crown, requiring licenses and payments. Unauthorized extraction was theft, not just of material, but of jurisdiction. Even underground wealth was mapped by law. Migration into towns frequently required proof of good standing or sponsorship by a guild or citizen. Freedom of the city was a status earned, purchased, or inherited. Without it, economic opportunity narrowed. A rural labourer seeking urban prosperity encountered a lattice of requirements: fees, oaths, apprenticeships. That shaped ambition into structured pathways. Freedom was literal status, not abstract concept. Fines for defamation or insult illustrate how medieval societies treated honour as legally significant. Calling someone a thief or adulterer without proof could result in ecclesiastical or secular penalty. Words wounded reputation, and reputation determined trade and marriage prospects. Thus speech was policed to preserve social cohesion. Gossip could escalate into litigation. Dress codes sometimes regulated not only luxury but mourning. Specific garments signaled bereavement, and the duration of wearing them could follow customary expectation. Even grief moved within socially enforced patterns. Public display of emotion had parameters. Excessive or insufficient mourning might draw criticism or suspicion. Animal trials, rare but documented, show the reach of legal imagination. When livestock caused harm, pigs injuring children for instance, authorities occasionally subjected animals to symbolic trial. While such events were infrequent, they reflect a worldview in which order required formal response, even to non-human disruption. Law asserted its universality theatrically. Trade secrecy extended to geographical protections. Certain towns guarded specialized production methods: fine cloth in Flanders, glass in Venetian territories. By restricting artisan emigration, skilled workers leaving without permission could face penalties, and foreign recruitment was monitored. Economic strength rested on controlled knowledge. Watermills and windmills, symbols of medieval landscape, were often compulsory facilities. Tenants had to grind grain at the lord's mill, paying a portion as fee. Bypassing it with hand mills undermined revenue and violated custom. The steady turning of millstones echoed a steady enforcement of privilege. Marriage contracts frequently included clauses about property reversion, if unions dissolved or heirs failed. These agreements were witnessed, recorded, and sometimes litigated decades later. Romantic union intertwined with economic strategy, codified carefully. Love operated within ledger lines. Military fortification within towns was regulated. Citizens might be assigned sections of wall to maintain at personal expense. Watch rotations were mandatory. Defence was decentralized yet obligatory. The sight of sturdy walls was thus the product of legal requirement, as much as architectural ambition. In certain regions, hunting seasons were fixed. Not only for royal forests, but communal lands, balancing sustenance and sustainability. Nets of regulation sought to prevent overuse, recognizing resource limits. Though enforcement could be uneven, the principle that nature required managed access was present. Plague ordinances expanded in later medieval centuries, specifying burial depth, isolation periods, and even restrictions on clothing trade from infected households. Cloth suspected of contagion might be burned. Commerce paused under health directives. Fear translated into regulation, and daily life shrank to narrower corridors of movement. Inheritance disputes sometimes hinged on legitimacy defined by canon law. Children born outside sanctioned marriage faced restricted rights, shaping social stigma into economic reality. Identity was not merely familial but legally classified from birth. Markets enforced not only quality but morality. Usury laws restricted interest rates, attempting to align commerce with religious doctrine. Jewish moneylenders and later Christian financiers navigated complex exceptions and prohibitions. Lending, essential for trade, existed under moral scrutiny, codified into law. Festive guild pageants required municipal approval for routes and content. Symbolism carried political meaning, and civic leaders monitored displays carefully. Celebration was public narrative shaped by regulation. Bridges and roads, lifelines of commerce, were funded by toll charters that specified exact amounts to be collected and durations for collection. Once construction costs were recovered, toll rights could expire, at least in theory. Infrastructure thus rested on contractual governance. Apprenticeship often included moral clauses forbidding gambling, marriage, or nighttime wandering during training years. Personal development was scripted. Youthful impulse encountered institutional discipline. Even agricultural tools could be regulated in communal fields to prevent damage to shared strips. Plough widths and drainage ditches required coordination. The choreography of farming relied on mutual compliance, enforced by village court. Debt bondage, though distinct from slavery, existed in various forms. Failure to meet obligations could result in temporary servitude. Economic misfortune translated into constrained liberty through legal mechanism, rather than brute seizure alone. Royal proclamations occasionally set maximum prices during scarcity, attempting to prevent profiteering. Enforcement challenges did not erase intent. Authority sought to stabilize survival. Ongoing feuds between families or clans were sometimes curtailed by peace statutes requiring arbitration. Retaliation cycles were legally interrupted to preserve order. Justice replaced vengeance, imperfectly but deliberately, in border territories influenced by entities like the Holy Roman Empire. Overlapping jurisdictions meant individuals could appeal to different courts depending on status. Imperial, local, ecclesiastical. Navigating these layers required awareness of privilege and risk. Law was mosaic, not monolith. Seasonal labourers travelling for harvest might require letters of passage, particularly in unstable times. Documentation became shield against suspicion. Public morality laws addressed prostitution by confining it to designated districts in some cities. Regulation acknowledged persistence while attempting containment. Vice was managed rather than eradicated. Throughout all these examples, the pattern remains consistent. Medieval law did not only react to crisis, it preemptively structured routine. It defined spaces, times, identities, relationships, resources, and risks. It translated hierarchy into habit. The extraordinary events recorded in chronicles, wars, coronations, rebellions rested atop this quiet architecture of everyday governance. People adapted. They learned loopholes, negotiated fines, sought exemptions, appealed to custom. Some prospered within the system, others chafed against it. Yet most lived with it as constant atmosphere. Authority was not distant thunder, but ambient air. Sometimes stifling, sometimes protective, always present. The medieval world, so often imagined as lawless or chaotic, was in truth saturated with order, an order expressed through innumerable small rules that guided how bread was baked, cloth was woven, land was tilled, contracts were sworn, bells were rung, and boundaries were walked. These laws rarely shouted their existence. They whispered through repetition, through routine, through the steady turning of seasons and statutes alike. And in that whisper lay the framework of a civilization whose habits of governance would echo forward into the legal cultures of the modern age. There were also laws that governed emotion in ways so subtle they barely seemed like laws at all. Public reconciliation after disputes could be required, especially in tightly bound villages where unresolved feuds threatened productivity and peace. Courts sometimes ordered symbolic gestures, handshakes before witnesses, shared meals, or public apologies to restore harmony. Justice did not always seek punishment, it sought reintegration. Yet even reconciliation was structured. Forgiveness followed formula. Apiculture, surprisingly important in a world without cheap sugar, was surrounded by custom. Beehives represented wealth, and disputes over swarms, settling on another's land, required adjudication. In some places, a swarm could be claimed only if pursued continuously from its original hive. If it rested unattended, ownership might transfer. Such precise rules reveal how deeply law penetrated into agricultural minutiae. Honey for candles and mead depended on legally defined pursuit. Stone quarries and clay pits, vital for construction, were likewise regulated. Extracting materials without seigneurial permission could result in fines. Even gathering stones from certain lands was restricted if those lands were reserved for fortification or ecclesiastical projects. The act of building a cottage could thus intersect with questions of jurisdiction. Moral discipline within monasteries and convents followed written rules, such as the rule of Saint Benedict, that governed daily schedule down to hours of prayer, silence, labour, and sleep. Though chosen vocations, these religious lives demonstrate medieval comfort with regulated time. The monastic clock, marking canonical hours, influenced broader society's sense of order. Structured devotion became model for structured life. In some regions, inheritance law required widows to remain unmarried for a specific mourning period before claiming full dower rights. This prevented rapid transfer of property to another household. Personal grief became intertwined with property management. Love and law overlapped again. Seasonal bans on certain fishing techniques protected spawning cycles, showing awareness of ecological balance. Nets with too small mesh might be prohibited because they caught immature fish. These early conservation instincts were embedded in local ordinance, reflecting pragmatic stewardship rather than modern environmental ideology. Urban sanitation laws occasionally specified where tanners, dyers, and butchers could operate, pushing foul-smelling trades to outskirts. Residential zoning emerged from discomfort and health concern. A craftsperson's livelihood could be geographically confined by decree. Disputes over watermills sometimes hinged on the height of dams, which could flood neighbouring fields. Courts measured water levels and imposed adjustments. Even flowing rivers were partitioned by legal measurement. Hydrology became courtroom matter. Servants' contracts often included curfews and restrictions on marriage during term of service. Personal milestones required employer consent. Labour was not only economic exchange but temporary guardianship over autonomy. In maritime law, jettisoning cargo during storms to save a ship triggered complex rules of shared loss known as general average. All merchants aboard contributed proportionally to the sacrificed goods' value. This principle balanced fairness against disaster, showing how even catastrophe was anticipated in legal thought. Pilgrimage, a spiritual journey, sometimes required permission from local lord or spouse, especially if absence would disrupt labour or household stability. Devotion was negotiated within obligation. In frontier settlements carved from forest or marsh, colonization charters often granted temporary tax exemptions to attract settlers. After grace periods ended, obligations resumed. Incentive and enforcement formed a cycle. Opportunity came tethered. Debt forgiveness during Jubilee years, inspired by biblical tradition, appeared sporadically in Christian realms. Though rarely fully realized, the idea that law could reset economic imbalance flickered within moral imagination. Clerical courts maintained registers of marital promises, made verbally but witnessed. A spoken vow could constitute binding contract. Casual speech risked unintended permanence. Words carried weight beyond intention. Even leisure animals such as falcons were controlled through sumptuary. Like distinctions, different ranks were entitled to keep specific birds. A peasant possessing a noble's falcon might face penalty. Prestige extended into companionship with creatures of prey. Road maintenance could be assigned to adjacent landholders under statutes, requiring trinoda necessitas in some traditions, obligation to maintain bridges, fortifications, and roads. Infrastructure relied on distributed duty rather than centralized bureaucracy. Inheritance by daughters in the absence of sons sometimes triggered wardship, granting lords temporary control over heiresses and the right to arrange marriages. Marriage thus became instrument of territorial strategy. Disaster response often included price controls on grain and prohibition of hoarding. Inspectors might search granaries to enforce compliance. Scarcity invited surveillance. Markets enforced spatial order. Specific goods sold in designated areas to prevent congestion and fraud. Fish in one quarter, cloth in another. The layout of commerce was legally scripted. Night soil collectors, essential for sanitation, operated under municipal regulation dictating hours and disposal sites. Even waste had procedure. Travelers carrying large sums might require official escort or documentation to deter banditry and false accusation. Protection could be purchased as legal privilege. In some territories influenced by Islamic governance in medieval Iberia, legal pluralism allowed Christian and Jewish communities to resolve internal matters under their own laws, while remaining subject to overarching authority. This layered system demonstrated pragmatic coexistence through regulated diversity. Throughout Europe, toll exemptions were granted to monasteries or favoured towns, creating economic hierarchies encoded in privilege. Commerce flowed unevenly according to charter. Oath helpers, compurgators, could support an accused person by swearing to their character. Reputation became quantifiable in number of supporters willing to risk perjury's spiritual consequence. Regulations sometimes limited the size of funeral gatherings during epidemics to prevent spread of disease. Even mourning crowds were trimmed by ordinance. In agrarian villages, gleaning rights allowed the poor to collect leftover grain after harvest. These rights were customary yet legally defended. Survival margins were protected through structured compassion. Guild feasts required attendance. Absence without cause might incur fine. Community cohesion was enforced socially and economically. Through all these threads runs a consistent pattern. Medieval governance rarely operated solely through spectacular punishment. Instead, it embedded expectation into routine. It anticipated conflict and scripted response. It mapped resources and ranked identities. It blended sacred and secular authority into a seamless fabric of obligation. For those living within it, this system did not feel like constant oppression, but like inherited structure. A child learned early which paths were permitted, which colours forbidden, which days holy, which markets lawful, which words dangerous. The boundaries were learned as naturally as seasons, and yet beneath that surface, negotiation and adaptation continued. Communities petitioned for revised charters. Lords commuted labour into rent. Towns purchased freedoms. Monarchs codified custom into statute. What began as whispered regulation slowly crystallized into enduring legal tradition. Thus, everyday medieval life unfolded within a dense architecture of quiet control. An architecture built not of stone alone, but of parchment, oath, habit, and memory. From the hum of bees to the toll of bells, from the mesh of fishing nets to the fabric of mourning clothes, law traced its lines. It shaped possibility without constant spectacle. It guided conduct not always through fear, but through repetition so steady it became indistinguishable from life itself. There were also quiet expectations about how space inside a home was used. Expectations that could slide into legal scrutiny if violated. In tightly packed towns, renting out rooms without permission could breach local ordinances, especially if overcrowding risked fire or disease. Subletting might require the landlord's approval, and unauthorized tenants could be expelled. Privacy, as we understand it, was limited. Households were public entities embedded in communal oversight. The walls of a house did not shield it from civic expectation. Seasonal labor obligations sometimes included mandatory participation in repairing roads after winter damage. Refusal could bring fines, and absence might be interpreted as shirking communal duty. Roads were lifelines for trade and communication, and their maintenance depended not on distant administrators, but on local compliance shaped by law. Every cart that rolled over repaired ruts was proof of regulated cooperation. In agricultural regions, the timing of harvest bells carried legal meaning. Beginning reaping too early could spark disputes, particularly in shared field systems, where synchronization prevented livestock from straying into unharvested strips. Law acted as metronome. The sound of a bell was not merely acoustic, it was authorization. Debt registers kept by towns recorded not only major transactions but minor ones, and default could escalate quickly. Property pledges, tools, livestock, even clothing might be temporarily seized until payment was rendered. These seizures were documented. There were also laws that governed absence as much as presence. If a tenant abandoned land without permission, manorial courts could declare the holding forfeit and reassign it, sometimes within weeks. Land was never meant to lie idle, and vacancy itself could be treated as breach of obligation. Mobility, which might seem like freedom, was legally suspect when it threatened productivity. A peasant who left in search of better opportunity risked being summoned back or losing hereditary claims. The soil anchored identity, and law guarded that anchor. In many towns, the ringing of the curfew bell, derived from the French couvre, few, meaning cover fire, signalled more than bedtime. Households were expected to dampen hearth flames to reduce fire risk. Failure to comply after repeated warnings could bring penalty. Night was governed by precaution. The quiet act of banking embers was both domestic routine and civic compliance. Price setting went beyond bread and ale. In times of scarcity, municipal councils attempted to regulate wages for certain trades to prevent inflation. Artisans could be fined for charging above permitted rates. While enforcement varied, the aspiration reveals anxiety over market instability. Medieval authorities understood that unchecked price fluctuation could fracture social order. Legal responsibility sometimes extended to livestock wandering into neighbours' fields. Animals found trespassing could be impounded in a pound until fines were paid. The owner bore costs not only of retrieval but damage assessment. Thus, fences and vigilance were economic necessities shaped by legal expectation. In some regions, bells also marked moments of communal obligation, such as assembling for court sessions or militia musters. Failure to appear after summons might result in fines or suspicion. Community participation was not optional, it was structured duty. Inheritance laws occasionally required the payment of relief, a fee paid by heirs to assume possession of land. Even death triggered financial transaction with overlords. Grief unfolded alongside obligation. Weights and measures were not merely standardized, they were symbolically displayed in public spaces, often chained to prevent tampering. The visible presence of official measures reinforced authorities' commitment to order. Trust was institutionalized. During harvest season, gleaning rights for the poor were sometimes protected by local ordinance, but these rights could be curtailed if deemed excessive. Compassion balanced against productivity. The law attempted to calibrate mercy without undermining property rights. Town charters often included clauses restricting foreign merchants from selling goods directly to consumers, requiring them instead to sell wholesale to local traders. This protected local economies but constrained competition. Outsiders encountered structured barriers. In certain territories, inheritance of craft membership was hereditary. A master's son could enter the guild more easily than an outsider. Social mobility was filtered through lineage reinforced by statute. Funeral bells, rung according to status, reflected hierarchy even in sound. The number of tolls or duration could correspond to rank. Law and custom intertwined to ensure social distinctions echoed audibly across community. Servitude contracts sometimes included penalties for speaking ill of masters. Reputation was guarded legally. Authority extended into tone and loyalty. When famine struck, authorities occasionally banned the export of grain to preserve local supply. Merchants attempting to move grain across borders without permission faced confiscation. Survival justified intervention. In maritime towns, salvage rights determined who could claim goods washed ashore after shipwreck. Without clear statute, chaos might follow disaster. Law stepped into uncertainty, dividing spoils and responsibility. Marriage bans, public announcements read in church before a wedding, served legal purpose. They allowed objections based on consanguinity or prior vows. Silence during bans implied communal consent. Marriage became public contract. During fairs, special courts known as pie powder courts, from pied's powder phase, dusty feet, referring to travelling merchants, resolved disputes swiftly to maintain commercial flow. Justice adapted to mobility. The right to bear certain surnames tied to land could be contested. Identity was not entirely self-determined. It reflected legal recognition of lineage and property. In some monastic territories, peasants owed specific produce, cheese, eggs, honey, as part of rent. Payments were itemized precisely. Agricultural diversity was shaped by obligation. Town walls closed at night, and late arrivals might need to pay gate fees or explain purpose. Urban space contracted after dark. Debt instruments sometimes required seals, and possessing a seal signified recognized legal agency. Illiterate individuals relied on marks or witnesses. Literacy amplified power. In plague years, clothing of the deceased could be burned or quarantined, disrupting inheritance of garments that otherwise passed through families. Fear reshaped tradition. Moral expectations around blasphemy or public drunkenness could result in fines or corporal punishment. Public behavior mattered because it reflected communal honor. In border marches, special legal codes sometimes applied, granting broader authority to local lords in exchange for defending frontier zones. Security justified exceptional governance. Widow remarriage might require settlement of previous dowry accounts before proceeding, delaying union. Financial clarity preceded personal choice. Travel along certain pilgrimage routes involved toll exemptions granted by charter, blending spiritual journey with economic privilege. All these measures illustrate how medieval law permeated daily existence without constant spectacle. It structured land tenure, trade, speech, marriage, inheritance, agriculture, and time itself. Its enforcement ranged from fines and confiscation to social pressure and ritual humiliation, yet much of it functioned through expectation rather than fear. People complied because compliance was habitual. because neighbours observed, because records endured. The medieval world was not governed solely by dramatic decrees, but by accumulated custom, layer upon layer of regulation guiding conduct. These laws did not always feel imposed, they felt inherited. A child growing into adulthood absorbed them as part of landscape, as natural as hedgerows or church spires. Within that framework, there was space for negotiation, petition, and gradual reform. Charters were bought, obligations commuted, statutes revised. What began as constraint sometimes evolved into defined right. The same system that required attendance at court also preserved records of precedent. Documentation could protect as well as bind. Thus, everyday life in the medieval period unfolded within a dense, quiet architecture of governance. From the curfew bell to the harvest field, from guild hall to parish church, from bridge toll to marriage banns, law shaped rhythm and relationship. It was rarely silent, yet rarely thunderous, more like a steady murmur beneath activity, guiding movement, limiting excess, preserving hierarchy, and sustaining order. In that persistent murmur lay the true mechanism of control. Not constant coercion, but continuous structure, woven so tightly into habit that it became indistinguishable from life itself. Beyond all the visible rules about land, trade, marriage, and faith, there existed another layer of medieval control that was almost psychological in nature. Laws and customs that shaped how people thought, feign about order, obedience, and possibility. Authority was not only something encountered in courts or marketplaces, it was internalized. Take hierarchy, for example. Medieval society was structured around the idea of the great chain of being, a belief that everything in existence had a fixed place, from God to kings, from nobles to peasants, from humans to animals. While not a statute written on parchment, this worldview was reinforced by legal systems everywhere. Sumptuary laws limited clothing by rank. Inheritance laws preserved noble bloodlines. Feudal contracts bound peasants to land. Over time, these rules trained people to see hierarchy as natural. Law and belief merged into one structure. Silence itself could be political. In village courts, ordinary people were expected to speak when summoned and remained silent otherwise. Interrupting proceedings could lead to fines. Deference was ritualized, caps removed, bows given, titles used properly. Language followed status. Calling a lord by the wrong title was not simply rude, it could be interpreted as disrespectful defiance. In many regions, communities were required to collectively report crimes. Failure to raise the hue and cry when witnessing theft or violence could bring penalties. Justice was participatory. Villagers were legally bound to chase a fleeing criminal. The burden of order did not sit solely with officials. It rested on neighbours. Community became enforcement mechanism. Even clothing repair could be scrutinised. Some guilds required official approval before selling second-hand goods, fearing undercutting of new production. Wearing excessively patched garments in urban settings could signal vagrancy and draw suspicion. Poverty itself was policed visually. Medieval calendars structured not only work but emotion. Lent demanded restraint. Advent encouraged reflection. Feast days allowed celebration. These cycles were not optional in deeply religious societies shaped by the authority of the Church. Skipping required observance without valid reason could draw ecclesiastical attention. Time was sacredly regulated. Noise pollution, though not described in modern terms, was addressed through ordinances.